second scripture this morning is from the prophet Isaiah. Bible study people will recognize that I changed the passage yet again this week. Isaiah chapter 42, verses 1 to 9. Here is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or make it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. He will not grow faint or be crushed until he has established justice in the earth. The coastlands wait for his teaching. Thus says God the Lord, who created the heavens and stretched them out, who spread out the earth and what comes from it, who gives breath to the people upon it, and spirit to those who walk in it. I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, and from the prison those who sit in darkness. I am the Lord, that is my name. My glory I give to no other, nor my praise to idols. See, the former things have come to pass. New things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them. This week was a fascinating week. We saw in the media one of the most immature exchanges between two grown men that we've seen in a long time. Politicians at that. Speaking at an anti-sexual assault rally, a good place to be, good things to be talking about, Joe Biden, referring to the president, they asked me if I'd like to debate this gentleman, and I said no. I said if we were in high school, I'd take him behind the gym and beat the hell out of him. And of course, the president replied with a tweet. Crazy Joe Biden is trying to act like a tough guy. Actually, he is weak, both mentally and physically, and yet he threatens me for the second time with physical assault. He doesn't know me, but he would go down fast and hard, crying all the way. Former vice president, the current president, likes schoolyard kids arguing who is the most manly, defining strength and manliness by an ability to inflict violence on the other. Now, I'm the father of a boy, and when John was that schoolyard kid, he was almost always the largest and strongest one in the schoolyard. We spent a lot of time and energy trying to teach him not to be that kid who used his strength to inflict violence on another. And frankly, there are times it's counterintuitive, but the biggest, strongest kid is often the target. Because if you can knock them down, then you get respect from everybody. And that happened more than once, that some kid would just walk up and sucker punch John for no reason at all. We spent lots of time teaching him, when that happens, back off. Back off. And he learned it. But here we have the vice president and the president talking in ways that none of us would want our kids to talk. It was another manifestation of this misunderstanding of what makes one masculine and powerful, the one in control, that happened shortly after the shooting at the school in Florida. And there was a writer who was putting out a prescription for how to deal with mass shootings and this kind of unexpected and unexplainable violence from young white boys. And he said boys aren't allowed to be boys anymore. And in that he was implying they're not allowed to be violent. And so when they try to stuff down this inherent masculine violence, eventually some of them explode. Mass shootings are just a symptom of that, he said. We have to stop stopping boys from being violent. And I couldn't help but hear that and wonder, well, why isn't that there aren't more young white males exploding in Northern Europe? Where, by all of those definitions, that's a much more feminized culture than we are. Then, of course, there's the argument that the way to stop violence is more violence. More thrown punches, more guns, more missiles. And it goes on and it becomes even more problematic when the argument is made that not only is violence the natural state of men, it is both moral and legal. John Bolton, the newly appointed national security advisor, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, I think it was on February 28th, so less than a month ago. And in his op-ed, he says that it is both legal and moral for the United States to do a first strike on North Korea. The implication is a nuclear first strike, although he doesn't say that specifically. And it's all based on this idea that they have the possibility of doing something really bad, and we don't like them very much, and we know they're not bad, so let's hit them first. He never deals with the moral questions of the resulting conflagration that would happen in Asia. He doesn't raise the question of what happens when you kill millions of people and trigger the deaths of millions more. None of that is even raised, but it is a moral and legal thing to do. He's made similar statements about Iran, although I'm not sure that he's written any of those down. And the problem of all of this is that when we define masculinity in this way, when we look at what makes power like this, that also colors the way we understand who God is. Because if we are created in the image of God, and worse than that, many of us still have this vision of God as a man, if that's what it means to be masculine, then it is also what it means to be God. A few years ago, the now disgraced but then rock star pastor of a church in the Pacific Northwest, Mark Driscoll, was yelling about, and literally yelling about, a demasculinized Jesus in the church, and how that was the problem for the church. And he ended one of his tirades about Jesus saying that he would not worship a Jesus whom he could beat in a fight in a back alley. I don't even know what to say to that one. I really don't. Now, perhaps there is an argument that violence is a tactic to change things. And some people whom I respect would argue that in a broken world, there are times and places where violence, horrible and sinful though it may be, is the best tactic. That's an argument and a discussion for another time and place. But I think it's important to say that there are folk, thoughtful folk, concerned people who make those arguments, and we're not going there at this point. But one thing is clear, and when Jimmy Carter was president, he said, he made that argument at times, that there were times and places where violence was required. But in the midst of making that argument, he also said, one thing is clear, that violence is always a symptom of the brokenness and sinfulness of the world. That it is a dysfunction that has nothing to do with God's vision of what it means to be a man, to be a human being, or especially to be the people of God. Violence has no place in God's yearnings for the world. A broken world may sometimes work by violence and force, but God always chooses love, grace, forgiveness, and self-giving. As we move towards Easter, especially today, today's a funny Sunday in the church calendar. You know, we all talk about it as Palm Sunday, and we have our palms, and we picture that. But in the liturgical calendar, it has two names and two groups of readings. The second one is Passion Sunday. Because there was a time when folk all went to church on Good Friday, and so we all heard those passages on Good Friday, but people don't do that anymore. And so if the church wanted people to understand what happened, they had to do it on a Sunday, because that's when the most people are present. And so they added a second set of readings for Passion Sunday, where they read pretty much the same things they get read on Good Friday. And so you have this interesting juxtaposition of the celebrations of Palm Sunday and the horrors of Passion Sunday. And during this time in the church year, we most clearly see those competing visions for creation, God's vision versus that of a broken and sinful system. We see God's commitment to something new, as I read here in this passage from Isaiah. And so when we celebrate Palm Sunday, we didn't read those passages, but I'm hopeful you know them enough to know what I'm talking about. We see instead that Jesus does not enter Jerusalem in violence and force, but instead in gentleness and compassion. He comes riding on a donkey surrounded by common folk, and common folk in those days meant really, really, really poor. Really poor. Instead of coming as a king in a chariot surrounded by an army with swords and shields. He comes with a commitment to those who need help the most. And in Isaiah's passage, a passage that we usually, as Christians, say this is applying to Jesus. The Jews said no, it applied to who they were supposed to be as a people. That's important to know. But we usually read it and say, this Isaiah was talking about Jesus, and he comes precisely refusing to extinguish the dimly burning wick, precisely refusing to break the already broken reeds. Those who were on the margins, those who were put beyond the center of society, and especially women and children. And instead, he embraces them. And he rejects the old ways of doing things, and instead comes in compassion and gentleness. Okay. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get depressed. Here's the part that excites me. Now, you know that I just finished a fascinating book on the Enlightenment and Enlightenment values. But one of the things that he does, he spends about a third of the book talking about the good things that are going on in the world. And he does this with chart after chart after chart after chart, and lots of numbers. And they're numbers that we tend not to know. Because in spite of what we see on the television news, what we read in the newspapers, what we see on the internet, what our guts tell us, guess what? Violence is lessening. It's not gone, but there's less. There are fewer wars than there used to be. And the wars there are kill fewer people. In spite of the horrors of the refugees fleeing Syria, there are fewer refugees now than there have been in previous times. Things are getting better. Gun violence is actually going down. Fewer people get murdered. The world is becoming more safe, not less, in spite of all of the fears that we feel. Even poverty. You know, the war on poverty that some folk like to say, yeah, well, we sure lost that one. Guess what? We didn't. When you look at the number of calories people have to live on now versus what they had even 30 years ago, the whole world is doing better. Things are getting better. Now, none of that is to say that there isn't a lot more to be done. There are still people who do not have enough to eat. There are too many people who die from gun violence. There are still refugees who have left the places that they have their roots and were their homes, and they don't have any place. All of that is horrific and needs to be addressed. But we need to know that we're making progress. As Barack Obama said, if you were given the choice to live at any time in history, not knowing who you would be, you would choose today. Because the likelihood is that if you were born today versus 50 years ago, versus 100 years ago, versus 300 years ago, today you'd be better off regardless of what part of society you were born into. We're doing better. We really are. I think that's grace. I really do. I think it's a function of us doing what we're supposed to be doing as God's people. Yesterday was one of the most wonderful illustrations of that I have seen, that I remember seeing in my life. And we were listening to the speakers from Washington, D.C. Didn't get to see them until later. I pulled them up on the web to see what their faces were. But teenager after teenager, and even pre-teenager after pre-teenager, wise beyond their years, called us to our better selves. There was a teenage boy in D.C. who spoke, and he said, now stop and listen. If you listen carefully, you can hear those who are committed to the status quo shaking because they know change is coming. And we saw that change. I believed it. It was extraordinary in my sense that these kids expanded the conversation beyond their immediate concerns. And when they first started, it really was all just about their immediate concerns. It was all about school shootings. But all of a sudden, wham, it's not just about school shootings. It's about gun violence everywhere. And I was particularly struck by how strongly they lifted up women of color as being disproportionate victims of gun violence. And that 11-year-old girl who stood up there and said, I stand for these women. And man, she was amazing. She was amazing. And there was a rainbow of colors and backgrounds and experiences. Even here in Santa Barbara, at the march in Santa Barbara, there was an African-American woman who stood up and called out white supremacy. She said, I'm uncomfortable doing this here in this crowd of almost all white people. But she did it. And more important than that, the organizers of the event said, we need to hear her and her voice. We're getting better. We're getting better. Step by step, moment by moment, year by year, we're getting better. Now, that doesn't mean that things are only going to get better. We've got battles ahead of us. We have a national security advisor who writes op-ed pieces justifying starting World War III as a moral thing to do. But we also have a generation of kids who are woke. And not only are they woke, they're saying, hey, all y'all rest of yins guys, I'm trying to be inclusive there. Got southern y'all and yins there. I'm sorry. All of the rest of you who have gotten a little bit complacent, who felt like you worked so hard and nothing changed and you're giving up, guess what? We're not going to let you do that. We're going to call you out as well and say, you need to get off your behinds and work with us. But if you don't, we're not going to stop. We're continuing. There is more to be done. We have seen incredible advancements. You know, we all know racism is real. But if you ask any African American that you know, are things better today than they were in 1955? They would laugh at you. What a stupid question. Of course it's better. Have we taken a step back recently? Well, yeah, maybe. But things are better. We need more. We need to continue to follow the example of Jesus as he entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. Gentleness and compassion. We need to embrace that vision that Isaiah spoke for the blessed community. Again, we have to remember that the Jewish folk who had that scripture a lot longer than we did, they read that and say, that refers to all of us. And it is all of our job to make the world a better place, to not extinguish the dimly burning wicks or break those already broken reeds. We need to live that Christian hymn. That's what Paul was quoting in the passage that Alexis read earlier. That was a hymn they sang in churches, and they all knew it well enough that Paul didn't even have to say, oh, and like the hymn says. It would have been just like if I had said, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Everybody would have known what I was referring to. That's how much they knew. Have this mind in yourselves, which was also in Christ Jesus, who emptied himself, taking on the form of a slave. We can embrace that. My preaching professor in seminary said, you can't have a sermon if it doesn't call you to action. Might be a good academic talk, might even be inspiring, but if it doesn't call to action, it's not a sermon. Well, our call to action is more. Do more. More love, more grace, more forgiveness, more embracing of those on the margins, more dreaming of a new world, and a way of getting there that is consistent with the values of that new world. And as we embrace that dream and live it in a consistent way, not with force and violence, but with gentleness, with love, with forgiveness, with compassion. Then the kingdom comes. Then God's kingdom comes. We're closer each day. We really are. But we're not there yet.